14 degrees Celsius. That is the air temperature at sunset in the Judean wilderness, 15 kilometers southeast of Jerusalem, on a night in late October. Wind from the northwest at 18 kilometers per hour. Wind chill equivalent at ground level, 8 degrees. Not Arctic, not freezing, but 8 degrees with wind exposure sustained for 10 hours against a body that has already burned through its caloric reserves for the day is a clinical environment. It is the kind of cold that does not announce itself. It accumulates, and by 3 in the morning, it has accumulated enough to separate two outcomes, not by luck, not by willpower, not by divine intervention, but by 6 specific, documentable, physiological and behavioral variables. Here is the finding. A healthy, averagely fit American adult, placed in the documented conditions of a routine apostolic field night, the temperature, the wind, the terrain, the caloric deficit, the absence of modern equipment, reaches the clinical threshold for moderate hypothermia within 6 hours of sunset. Core temperature below 35 degrees Celsius, judgment impaired. Coordination degraded. Without intervention, the progression continues. In the same location, on the same night, the apostolic group, 12 men in wool cloaks, lying in physical contact on the floor of a limestone overhang, reaches morning with core temperatures above 36.5 degrees. They slept, and they will walk another 25 kilometers tomorrow. The difference is not faith. The apostles were fishermen and tax collectors in their 20s and 30s, not endurance athletes. The difference is 6 variables, every one measurable, every one acquirable, none requiring purchased equipment. They require something else. Years of exposure to conditions that the modern built environment has systematically eliminated. And in the specific domain of overnight survival in wet Mediterranean cold, with caloric deficit, the technology gap runs in the wrong direction. The overhang is still there. October is still cold. Now break the 2 myths. The myth of apostolic exceptionalism, that spiritual endurance or divine protection explains their survival. Every advantage the apostolic profile holds is a knowledge, adaptation or behavioral variable acquirable by any healthy adult. The myth of modern superiority, that gear and technology make apostolic-era capacity irrelevant. Wool outperforms synthetic when wet. Group thermoregulation outperforms solo insulation layering. Terrain knowledge outperforms GPS in locating resources. GPS does not catalog. The overhang is still there. And the comparison begins now. The Judean wilderness is not desert in the way most English speakers imagine. The Hebrew midbar and the Greek eremos denote uninhabited land. Land without permanent settlement, without cultivated fields, without the social infrastructure of a village. But this is not sand. This is Cenomanian and Turonian limestone karst, a geological formation that has been weathering, dissolving and fracturing under seasonal rainfall for approximately 90 million years, producing a landscape of ridges, wadis, shallow caves and exposed rock faces that extends from the watershed ridge east of Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea Rift, dropping roughly 1,200 meters of elevation, over 25 kilometers of horizontal distance. Nothing is flat. A day's travel involves continuous undulation, descending into wadis, climbing out of them, traversing ridgelines, descending again. The limestone surface is uneven, fractured and abrasive. It is terrain that demands constant foot placement attention, engages stabilizer muscles in the ankles and knees with every step, and adds approximately 15 to 20% to the caloric cost of walking compared to the same distance on a paved surface. The modern American who has walked a 28-kilometer day on pavement, which is itself unusual enough to constitute a noteworthy physical achievement by contemporary standards, has not walked a 28-kilometer day on this. The apostolic group traveled this terrain regularly. The route from Jerusalem to Jericho, 28 kilometers through the heart of the wilderness, is referenced directly in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and the descent from the Judean highlands to the Jordan Valley and back is documented as a repeated travel pattern during the ministry period. Mark 6, verse 33 documents a crowd running ahead of the boat and arriving before the disciples, implying walking speeds consistent with 25 to 35 kilometers of daily travel on foot. This was not exceptional. This was operational baseline. 28 kilometers on limestone cast with 400 meters of cumulative elevation gain in wool garments and leather sandals produces a caloric expenditure of 3,800 to 4,200 kilocalories. Against that, Mark 6 verses 8 and 9 records the equipment list: staff, sandals, 1 tunic, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. Luke 10 verse 7 documents the provisioning model. Eat what is set before you in each village. Between villages, the available provisions were bread from the last host, olives from trees along the route, dried fish if any had been preserved. Estimated intake: 1,400 to 1,800 kilocalories. Caloric deficit entering the night: 2,400 kilocalories. That deficit does not reset. It changes the metabolic terms of everything that happens after dark. A body in deficit downregulates peripheral circulation earlier, shifts to fat oxidation that is slower to sustain. For a body adapted to intermittent deficit through years of this provisioning model, the shift is familiar and efficient. For one that has never experienced sustained deficit, it is clumsy, delayed, and metabolically expensive. Sunset in late October, 1715. Within 45 minutes, air temperature drops to 14 degrees. Wind maintains 18 kilometers per hour through the first half of the night. By 0300, the wind eases, but the air temperature reaches its minimum of 10 to 11 degrees, and radiative cooling pulls ground level temperature to 7 to 9 degrees. Relative humidity rises toward the dew point, 8 to 12 degrees in the Judean highlands in October. When temperature meets dew point between 0300 and 0500, surface condensation begins. Dew forms on every exposed surface, including clothing. And the behavior of that dew on the clothing surface is the first variable: the wool cloak. The outer garment, hymation in Greek, simla in Hebrew, a rectangular piece of woven wool, approximately 2 meters by 1.5 meters, worn wrapped around the body during the day and used as a blanket at night. Exodus 22, verse 26, documents this dual function explicitly. If a creditor takes a man's cloak as collateral, he must return it by sunset, because it is his only covering for his body. What else will he sleep in? The legal provision confirms what the material culture record indicates. The wool cloak was the primary and often only insulation system available to a person sleeping outdoors in the Levant. The specific wool used in 1st century Judean textiles was from the Awassi sheep breed, a fat-tailed breed indigenous to the region, producing a fiber with a diameter of approximately 25 to 35 microns, coarser than modern merino, but finer than modern carpet wool. The natural lanolin content of unwashed Awassi wool is approximately 10 to 15% by weight, and the cloaks of working people were not scoured to remove lanolin, because lanolin is the property that makes wool water-resistant. A 1st century wool cloak retaining its natural lanolin has an insulation value of approximately 2.5 to 3 CLO units when dry, comparable to a modern heavyweight wool blanket or a well-made down jacket. When wet, and the overnight conditions produce dew saturation on any exposed textile surface, the performance divergence begins. Wool fiber is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture into the fiber core through hydrogen bonding with the keratin protein structure, releasing a small amount of heat in the process. The heat absorption, approximately 104 kilojoules per kilogram of water absorbed. That heat release is not trivial. It is a measurable warming event that occurs precisely when the cold is increasing and the body most needs thermal input. The moisture is held within the fiber, not between fibers, and the trapped air between fibers, which is the actual insulation medium, remains largely undisturbed. A wool cloak saturated with dew retains approximately 80% of its dry insulation value, 2.4 CLO units at saturation. The sensation of wet wool against skin at 8 degrees wind chill is specific and entirely different from wet synthetic, warm at the core where the lanolin-sealed fiber has trapped a layer of humid air, cold only at the exposed outer surface where the wind finds the fiber tips. The cold does not penetrate, it stays on the surface, the modern equivalent. A polyester fleece jacket rated at 1.8 CLO dry. Polyester is hydrophobic, Moisture fills the spaces between fibers, displacing insulating air. No heat absorption, no moisture management within the fiber. Saturated with dew, 0.27 CLO units, 15% of dry performance. The gap when dry is modest. The gap when wet, the actual field condition, is eightfold. Calculated through the Gagé thermoregulation model for a resting adult at 8 degrees wind chill over 10 hours. The wool profile maintains core temperature above 36.5 degrees throughout the night. The fleece profile reaches 35 degrees within 6 hours. One variable, one garment, one material property. The modern material loses. The second variable involves bodies, 12 of them. When the apostolic group settles for the night, they do what every traditional culture operating without fixed shelter in cold environments has done. They lie down in physical contact. 12 adult males, each producing 80 watts of metabolic heat at rest, generate 960 watts in a confined space. A limestone overhang 4 meters deep and 6 wide, ceiling height 1.5 to 2 meters, volume approximately 40 cubic meters. 960 watts continuous in that volume, with limestone walls reflecting radiant heat back toward occupants, produces a microclimate 6 to 8 degrees above ambient. At 8 degrees wind chill, the overhang reaches 14 to 16 degrees. At that temperature with wet wool at 2.4 CLO, core temperature maintenance is not a challenge. The cloaks overlap where bodies touch, creating a shared insulation layer, a collective thermal unit. Studies of communal sleeping in Bedouin, Maasai, and Quechua communities consistently show a 4 to 8 degree microclimate advantage for groups of 6 or more under shared covering. The modern American adult in the same overhang has one body, 80 watts. In a 40 cubic meter space where the thermal mass of the limestone walls is actively conducting heat away from the air and into the rock faster than 80 watts can replace it, the microclimate advantage is less than 1 degree Celsius above ambient. Negligible. The solo occupant is functionally sleeping outdoors with a roof that blocks rain, but provides no meaningful thermal amplification, and the solo body has no overlapping cloaks. One cloak, if the modern adult even possesses one, covers one body. There is no shared insulation layer. There is no collective thermal unit. There is a single human radiator in a stone room that absorbs heat faster than that radiator can produce it. The thermoregulation ratio is 12 to 1, not because the individual is weaker, because physics does not negotiate with group size. 960 watts raises the temperature of a confined space, 80 watts does not, and no amount of fitness, determination, or survival knowledge substitutes for 880 watts of heat that is simply not there. The third variable determines whether the overhang is available at all. The Judean wilderness contains thousands of limestone overhangs. Not all are adequate shelters. A south-facing overhang with a depth-to-width ratio of 1 to 1.5, on the lee side of a ridge relative to northwest wind, with an inner face darkened by smoke residue from previous occupants, that is an effective shelter. South-facing means solar heat absorbed into the rock face during the day, released through the first half of night. The depth ratio means wind is blocked but body heat reflects off the inner face. The smoke residue is the field indicator of correct thermal geometry. A north-facing overhang deeper than wide channels wind and increases convective heat loss. Sleeping in it is worse than sleeping in the open. The apostolic group, traversing this terrain repeatedly over 3 years, accumulated a functional map of these shelters, operational, not written. Fishermen from the Sea of Galilee, accustomed to reading water, wind, and weather as occupational necessities, transferred those pattern recognition skills to terrain with the fluency of people for whom environmental reading is a baseline cognitive function. The modern adult sees undifferentiated limestone. Assessing south-facing orientation without a compass requires knowledge of the sun's path. Evaluating depth-to-width ratios requires spatial judgment calibrated through experience sleeping in those formations. Reading smoke residue requires knowing what it signifies. Without the ability to distinguish effective from ineffective shelter, the most likely outcome is no overhang at all. The modern adult looks for a building, finds none, and selects flat ground in the open, the worst possible position. 3 variables documented: insulation under wet conditions, group thermoregulation, terrain knowledge. In each case, the apostolic advantage is not strength or endurance. It is knowledge and behavioral adaptation accumulated through years of exposure. The apostles were not physically superior. They were operating within adaptations their lives built without intention. The modern adult has not built those adaptations, not because they are unavailable, but because the modern environment provides no occasion for them. Climate control removes cold exposure. Individual housing removes group thermoregulation. Paved roads remove terrain reading. 3 of 6 variables are knowledge variables, all acquirable without equipment. The apostolic profile has all 3. The modern profile has none. That is not a theological finding. That is a preparation gap. And we are not halfway through the assessment. The complete cold weather field protocol covering all 6 variables, with specific practice methods derived from documented apostolic-era adaptations and validated against current wilderness medicine standards, is in the pinned comment below. 3 variables remain. The 4th variable is invisible. It happens inside the body in tissue most people do not know they have. Brown adipose tissue, BATE, located in the supraclavicular, paravertebral and perirenal regions. Unlike white fat, which stores energy, BAT burns energy to produce heat through mitochondrial uncoupling. A protein called UCP1 allows the proton gradient to dissipate as heat rather than driving ATP synthesis. Direct thermogenesis without muscular contraction, non-shivering thermogenesis. In adults with active BAT, cold exposure triggers sustained heat output of 100 to 150 watts without shivering, without motor impairment, at a caloric cost 40 to 60% lower than shivering producing equivalent heat. BAT activity is adaptive. Regular cold exposure, outdoor work, sleeping without climate control, travel in variable weather, stimulates BAT recruitment over weeks to months. PET-CT studies show cold-adapted individuals exhibit 2 to 3 times higher BAT glucose uptake than non-adapted subjects. The apostolic group's operational profile, years of outdoor work, overnight temperatures regularly below 15 degrees, no climate-controlled environments, is consistent with high BAT activity and efficient non-shivering thermogenesis as the primary overnight heat production mechanism. The modern American adult spends 93% of time indoors, between 20 and 22 degrees. BAT activity, functionally dormant. The primary cold response is shivering, effective at 300 to 500 watts, but burning 700 to 1,000 kilocalories per hour, 3 to 4 times the metabolic cost of BAT thermogenesis. In a body carrying a 2,400 kilocalorie deficit, sustained shivering exhausts glycogen reserves within 3 to 4 hours, forcing a transition to slower fat oxidation that produces a transient drop in heat output during the early morning hours when ambient temperature is lowest. That drop is the window in which core temperature crosses 35 degrees. Shivering has a second cost. It prevents sleep. Stage 3 slow-wave sleep and REM both require suppression of muscular activity. Shivering is involuntary muscular activity. It directly prevents restorative sleep stages. A shivering body hovers between stage 1 and stage 2, fragmented by shivering episodes. The cognitive consequence is equivalent to 24 to 36 hours of total sleep deprivation. The metabolic consequence. Sleeping metabolism is 15 to 20% lower than waking, a conservation the shivering body does not receive, deepening the caloric deficit through the night. The apostolic group, thermoregulating through BAT in a 14 to 16 degree microclimate, reaches stage 3 sleep. They recover. The modern adult, shivering alone at 7 to 9 degrees in wet synthetic, does not reach stage 3 at any point. The 5th variable is water, not dramatic desert dehydration, but the interaction between sweat-induced sodium loss and the vascular constriction that is the body's first defense against cold. 28 kilometers in October, sun produces sweat loss of 2 to 3 liters, carrying 400 to 600 milligrams of sodium per liter. Total sodium deficit, 800 to 1800 milligrams. Mild hyponatremia that would produce no symptoms in warmth. But the body's first thermoregulatory response to cold, peripheral vasoconstriction, depends on electrolyte balance to maintain vessel wall smooth muscle tone. In a sodium-depleted state, vasoconstriction is blunted. Vessels do not constrict fully. Peripheral heat loss continues at a rate a sodium-replete body would have reduced. Core cooling begins earlier and progresses faster. The apostolic group operated from a functional hydration map. Springs, cisterns, seasonal seeps, village wells documented in biblical text and archaeology. En-Gedi, the springs along Wadi Kelt, Jacob's Well. Waypoints internalized through repeated traversal. And the sodium deficit was partially offset through diet. Olives and dried fish, the standard portable provisions, carry 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of sodium per 100 grams. The modern adult has no terrain-specific water knowledge. GPS provides topography, but does not catalog seasonal spring seeps or partially collapsed cisterns. The sodium deficit enters the night unmanaged, blunting vasoconstriction, accelerating core cooling. The variable wilderness medicine clinicians call the silent contributor, rarely the primary cause of hypothermia, consistently present as an aggravating factor. The sixth variable determines whether the night's damage is recoverable. For the cold-adapted individual in a thermally adequate group microclimate, the overnight core temperature nadir, normally between 0300 and 0500, is exaggerated by approximately half a degree. BAT compensates smoothly. Sleep architecture progresses through restorative stages. The individual wakes cold but cognitively intact, and fat oxidation systems trained by years of intermittent deficit begin mobilizing energy within minutes. For the non-adapted solo individual, the cascade closes. Shivering prevents restorative sleep. The absence of restorative sleep prevents the metabolic conservation that limits caloric deficit deepening. The deepened caloric deficit reduces the fuel available for shivering thermogenesis. Reduced shivering output allows further core cooling. Further core cooling triggers more intense shivering, if fuel is available, or if glycogen reserves are depleted, fails to trigger adequate shivering at all, and the core temperature decline accelerates without a compensatory response. This is not a theoretical cascade. It is the documented progression of field hypothermia in unacclimatized individuals, described in the wilderness medicine literature as the exhaustion hypothermia pathway. Distinct from immersion hypothermia or acute exposure hypothermia in that the primary driver is not extreme cold, but sustained moderate cold combined with caloric depletion and the failure of restorative sleep. It is the pathway that kills hikers who are found in conditions that seem, to the rescue team arriving in daylight, insufficiently cold to be lethal. 8 degrees, not Arctic, not extreme, just sustained, overnight, against a body that has no reserves left to fight it with. The specific sound of it is documented by anyone who has spent a night in the field with a hypothermia patient. The shivering that started as a fine tremor in the first hour becomes gross, whole body shaking by the 4th hour, the jaw muscles clenching in 2 to 3 second cycles, the shoulders pulling inward, the fabric of the clothing moving against the ground with each shiver cycle. And then, sometime in the early morning hours, the shivering stops. Not because the body is warm, because the body has exhausted the metabolic fuel to sustain the shivering response. And the silence that follows that cessation is the sound of the core temperature falling without opposition. The comparison is complete. 6 variables measured against identical conditions: thermal insulation wet performance, 2.4 versus 0.27 CLO, group thermoregulation, 960 versus 80 watts, terrain knowledge, functional versus absent. Cold thermogenesis, BAT mediated at 150 watts versus shivering at 500 watts, with 4 times the caloric cost. Hydration management, terrain-specific MAP with sodium supplementing provisions versus no MAP and unmanaged deficit. Sleep architecture, restorative versus shiver fragmented with compounding caloric loss. Every advantage the apostolic profile holds is a knowledge, adaptation, or behavioral variable. Cold adaptation requires cold exposure. Terrain knowledge requires terrain time. Group thermoregulation requires a group with shared field experience. Material knowledge requires the experience of discovering that wool outperforms synthetic when wet. Caloric efficiency requires years of intermittent deficit training the body's fat oxidation. Water source knowledge requires a home territory traversed enough times that the springs become waypoints. None of these develop in a climate-controlled indoor life with abundant food, GPS navigation, and synthetic gear. They develop in people who spend years outdoors in variable weather with uncertain food supply and a known landscape. The development of those adaptations requires something that the modern built environment does not provide and actively discourages: sustained, repeated, moderate discomfort. Cold mornings without reaching for the thermostat. Nights without the synthetic insulation that climate-controlled indoor life has made the default. Days of walking on terrain that requires attention rather than roads that do not. Meals that are insufficient deliberately to train the metabolic flexibility that caloric abundance has allowed to atrophy. Nights outdoors in groups, in physical contact, developing the social thermoregulation behavior that individual bedrooms in individual houses have eliminated from the modern behavioral repertoire. Not suffering, not asceticism, training. The same category of progressive physiological overload that a runner undertakes to improve VO2 max, documented, validated, and effective. The apostles did not train for wilderness survival. They did not intend to build the profile this comparison documents. They built it incidentally, through years of living in an environment that demanded every one of these adaptations as a condition of daily life. The fishermen of the Sea of Galilee did not choose cold adaptation. The lake chose it for them. The tax collector walking the Roman roads did not choose terrain knowledge. The roads chose it for him. The provisioning model documented in the Gospels did not intend to train metabolic flexibility. The economics of itinerant ministry produced that deficit as an unavoidable consequence. And the bodies adapted because that is what human physiology does under repeated demand. The apostles were not surviving despite their conditions. They were operating within a physiological and behavioral envelope that their lives had built, without any of them setting out to build a survival system. The modern adult has not built that envelope, not because it is unavailable, because the modern environment provides no occasion for it. The limestone overhang is still there. The October wind is still northwest at 18 kilometers per hour. The wool of the Awassi sheep still has the same fiber diameter, the same lanolin content, the same wet performance characteristics unchanged in 2,000 years. The human body still contains recruitable brown adipose tissue, still responds to cold exposure with trainable non-shivering thermogenesis, still benefits from group thermoregulation, still reads terrain more effectively with experience than with any technological substitute. The physiology has not changed, the environment has not changed, the preparation has changed. The apostolic group arrived carrying 3 years of accumulated adaptation their lives had built. The modern adult arrives carrying the specific absence of every one of those adaptations, produced by a built environment, optimized for comfort, and the systematic removal of every form of moderate environmental stress the human body was shaped, over 2 million years, to respond to, adapt to, and thrive in. The overhang does not care which profile enters it. The wind does not negotiate. The dew does not wait. Only one profile arrives with the insulation, the group, the knowledge, the metabolic flexibility, the hydration infrastructure, and the sleep architecture to make it to morning. The other reaches 35 degrees by 0300 and does not understand why the cold feels like it is coming from inside. The finding is not that the apostles were remarkable. The finding is that the modern adult is specifically, measurably unprepared for conditions that represented a routine night for 12 men whose only equipment was a wool cloak, whose only shelter was a rock formation they knew how to read, and whose only thermoregulation technology, beyond the wool, was each other. That is not a judgment, it is a measurement. And the question the physiology asks is not whether you believe the apostles were extraordinary. It is whether you could make it to morning in the same overhang, under the same wind, with the same deficit, without the 6 variables that got them there. The answer for the average American adult in a climate-controlled room is documented in the thermoregulation models, the CLO tables, the BAT studies, and the field hypothermia literature. And the answer is no. Not because you are weak, because you are unprepared. And the distance between those two words is the entire point.